everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful event that we're sponsoring in cooperation with the Hauenstein Center at Grand Valley State University. I want to commend you also for focusing your time on things intellectual as opposed to the World Series. But our speaker and all of us are well aware that you may want to watch that later in the evening. But I'm glad your priorities are in the right place, and we're glad to have you here. We do a significant number of programs in collaboration with the Hauenstein Center, and it's always a pleasure to work with them. They bring wonderful, intellectually challenging speakers to us here in West Michigan, and we're glad to have this partnership. As many of you know, tonight's program is supported with financial support from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and I would like to recognize Joe Calvaruso, the Executive Director of the Foundation, and all of the members of the Foundation and the Friends of Ford who are in this audience for their continued support. So Joe, you want to take a bow? Now that we have the flag properly positioned as it should be at a presidential museum, and the lights focused on the podium, it's my pleasure to introduce Gleaves Whitney, who is the director of the Hauenstein Center, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and let me second the wonderful partnership that we enjoy. You know, there are only 12 official presidential sites around the country. That gives each community that has one of those sites wonderful opportunities to partner, and the Ford Presidential Foundation and the Hauenstein Center have been very fortunate to be able to team up, and we are so proud of that partnership, Joe with you and Elaine and Jim with you. Thank you very much for all that you contribute, and since the President Emeritus there of the Ford Foundation, Marty Allen, is there, I want to mention you too. So thank you very much. Well, this evening's speaker, Dr. George Nash, will tell you that in the course of spending many years in Iowa doing research on Herbert Hoover, there were three things he never got used to: December, January, and February. So to escape winters in the Midwest, he'd go to a balmier place, his home in the South of Massachusetts, that is. When he's not in the Hawkeye or Bay States, Dr. Nash spends much time in Michigan. He's a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center just up the road in Mecosta. Nor is he a stranger to Grand Rapids. By my count, this evening marks the fourth time Dr. Nash has given a talk for the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, the Ford Foundation, the Ford Presidential Museum. A Harvard PhD and an independent scholar, Dr. Nash has developed into one of the finest contemporary essayists writing today from the scholarship of history. We are proud to count him as an associate of the Hauenstein Center as well. Dr. Nash has traveled tens of thousands of miles, I mean that literally, in the course of researching the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. He's landed in more than 100 airports. His work has taken him from the White House to the goldfields of Western Australia in pursuit of his quarry. In every area of scholarship in which he ventures, Dr. Nash becomes the authority. You may have seen him Monday evening on PBS, where he was the lead historian for the documentary called Landslide, a portrait of President Herbert Hoover. His commentary was a distillation of his definitive three-volume biography of the great engineer. Dr. Nash is also the world's foremost authority on America's conservative intellectual movement since 1945. His book by the same title is now in its second edition. His newest book, Reappraising the Right, will become officially available this coming Monday. But if you walked through the foyer, of course, you have a very special chance this evening, being some of the first people in the United States to have access to this book. Pulling material from that book is at the heart of this evening's lecture. It's titled Hardscrabble Lessons: Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression, and American Conservatism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George Nash.
Well, thank you very much, Gleaves, and good evening, everyone. Precisely 80 years ago today, the American stock market on Wall Street suffered its worst crash in history. It fell on a Tuesday that year, and ever since that terrible day has been remembered as Black Tuesday. Now, some of you may think that it takes some nerve for a biographer of Herbert Hoover to show up tonight to mark the anniversary. But whether it be a case of chutzpah on my part, or as I prefer to think, a commitment to sound scholarship, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. So thank you again, Gleaves, for your most gracious introduction and for your kind reference to my new book. And my thanks also to the staff of the Hauenstein Center, and to Mr. Ralph Hauenstein, its founder and benefactor, and to Elaine Didier, Jim Kratzis, and their colleagues here at the Gerald Ford Museum, and to Joe Calvaruso of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for all of the hospitality that all of you have extended to me today. I come here tonight neither to praise Herbert Hoover nor to bury him, but to understand him, and in the process to rescue him from some of the mythology that now surrounds his name. The distinguished historian John Lukács likes to say that the principal task of a historian is the reduction of untruth. The reduction of at least a few half-truths is one of my aims in this lecture. Often it seems that Herbert Hoover has become the Rodney Dangerfield of American politics. He gets no respect. Other unpopular presidents, like Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman, have recovered their reputations posthumously. A few, like Ronald Reagan, have lived to see their ratings rise. Some presidents whom historians deem mediocre, such as Grover Cleveland and William Howard Taft, are conceded in retrospect to have possessed commendable integrity. But not Hoover, at least not in our media and political culture of 2009. Consider the evidence. A few years ago, in 2004 to be exact, a caravan of 51 unemployed Americans descended on the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum in West Branch, Iowa. They were part of a national Show Us the Jobs tour organized by the AFL-CIO. Upon reaching the Hoover Library grounds, the travelers disembarked from their buses, lined up near the museum entrance, unfurled a Show Us the Jobs banner, and had themselves photographed. Why did they stop in West Branch? Because, explained one of the organizers, George Bush is the first president since Herbert Hoover to have a net job loss. This was 2004. We're just here, she said, to acknowledge Herbert Hoover. Acknowledgement indeed. The tour group did not bother to visit his museum. Having staged their photo op, they reboarded their buses and moved on. Their stay in West Branch lasted just 12 minutes. The Show Us the Jobs media event is emblematic of the use to which Hoover's name was being put in that election year and is being put even now. Across the land, political opponents of President Bush in 2004 were reciting the argument that he was the first president to lose jobs since Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. Whatever one may think of the statistical basis for this charge, the intention of Bush's critics was clear: to tie him rhetorically to a man perceived by the critics to have been a presidential failure. What was happening here? And what is happening here? Why was Hoover suffering once more from a bad press? At one level, the answer is obvious. Like consumer confidence data and the monthly unemployment rate, Hoover has become an economic indicator. Whenever the economy falters, the mention of his name shoots up. Today, 45 years after his death and more than 70 after his presidency, he remains a historical punching bag, a symbol of hard times, ineptitude, and indifference. The development of this symbolism was not exactly accidental during his lifetime. During Hoover's administration between 1929 and 1933, the Democratic Party's chief publicist and spinmeister, a man named Charles Michelson, orchestrated an unremitting barrage of disparagement of Hoover's shortcomings in press releases. It was a foretaste of what a later generation would call the politics of personal destruction. As the economy worsened, the nation's travails were increasingly personalized. Millions of bewildered Americans were looking for a scapegoat, and Hoover became it. It was not the Great Depression, it was the Hoover Depression. Shanty towns of the homeless were called Hoovervilles. The insides of trouser pockets were called Hoover handkerchiefs. Newspapers were called Hoover blankets. Armadillos were called Hoover hogs. The temptation to interpret the Depression as a giant morality play, replete with heroes and knaves, did not abate when Hoover left office. Franklin Roosevelt perceived the world in such judgmental terms. In his 1933 inaugural address, he roundly denounced the nation's money changers, as he called them, the bankers, as the villains in the drama, and vowed to restore, as he called it, the temple of our civilization to the ancient truths. Later on in his first term, he castigated those he labeled economic royalists and pledged ominously to make himself their master. For years to come, at election time, Roosevelt and his Democratic successors ran against Hoover. In 1948, President Harry Truman, who privately admired Hoover, nevertheless lambasted him on the hustings. If the Republicans win the election, he claimed, it will bring back the era of the Hoover cart. Quote, the remains of the old Tin Lizzie being pulled by a mule because you couldn't afford to buy a new car and you couldn't afford to buy gas for the old one. That was Truman speaking. The Hoover cart, he said, was the only automobile in the world that eats oats. And so it goes whenever the economy weakens. In 1987, as some of you may recall, when the stock market suddenly plummeted, allusions to Hoover and the crash of 1929 quickly filled the airwaves, and films of Depression-era red lines appeared on television. In 1992, when President George Herbert Walker Bush ran for re-election at the end of a recession, you may recall that some of his leading opponents ridiculed him as George Herbert Hoover Walker Bush. Old habits among politicians die hard. Today's critics of Hoover on the left, then, are heirs to a long and by now reflexive tradition of political oratory. To them, he is little more than an advertising slogan of a sort, a Pavlovian stimulus meant to elicit an emotional response. Hoover, depression. Hoover, unemployment. Hoover, Republicans. It is pro-New Deal historiography reduced to a pejorative catchphrase. But if Hoover wins little respect these days among Democrats, where are his defenders among Republicans? The answer is almost nowhere, and therein lies another curious tale. During Hoover's long and productive ex-presidency, he lived longer as an ex-president than any other holder of the White House office, he came to be revered by many in the GOP. His philippics against the New Deal inspired many of the party faithful. A patron of Human Events magazine, the Freeman magazine, and other conservative causes, he was admired as a benevolent grandfather figure on the American right. To his liberal opponents and a considerable number of voters in those years, his name continued to connote hard times and failed leadership. But to his conservative supporters, it conveyed an image of resilient rectitude. When Hoover died in 1964, however, his political comeback died with him. And within a decade and a half, his image radically changed. In the 1980s, rather even before then, it was changing, but late in his life, just before he died, he was being acclaimed as the greatest Republican of his generation. So you might say his life ended on a note of greater respect. But by the 1980s, he was being likened on the right to Jimmy Carter, who at least at that time was being considered a failed president and being often compared to Hoover. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, one of his first acts was to hang a portrait of Calvin Coolidge in a prominent place in the White House. During his presidency, Reagan was known to quote Franklin Roosevelt, but not Hoover in his speeches. Reagan himself was not publicly critical of his Republican predecessor, but among a rising generation of conservative pundits and politicians, Hoover fell completely from favor. What happened? In the 1970s, a new conservative orthodoxy known as supply-side economics was born. And I think perhaps some of you have heard a bit about it this fall if you've been attending other events sponsored by the Hauenstein Center. Led by the free market economist Arthur Laffer, the writer Jude Wanniski, Representative Jack Kemp, and the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, the supply-siders built a powerful case for the reduction of tax rates as the answer to the oppressive stagflation of the Carter years. Their arguments became the intellectual foundation for the so-called Reagan Revolution and the dominant economic paradigm of the Republican Party to this day. Searching for historical precedents to buttress their policy agenda, the supply-siders extolled the tax-cutting program of Calvin Coolidge and his conservative Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, as well as the tax cuts propounded by John F. Kennedy 40 years later. Significantly, they did not turn in the least to Herbert Hoover. In the eyes of the evangelical supply-siders, Hoover had committed two disastrous blunders. First, in 1930, he had signed into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a protectionist measure which, in their view, fractured the world economy and converted the crisis of 1929 into a catastrophe. Second, in late 1931 and 1932, Hoover had proposed, and a Democratic-dominated Congress had enacted, a massive tax increase in a desperate effort to balance the federal budget. It was the largest percentage peacetime tax cut, or tax increase rather, in American history. It was a precedent which naturally did not appeal to conservative Reaganites in the 1980s or since. And that was it. Supply-side theorists and devotees showed little interest in any other part of Hoover's record. His belief in voluntarism, for example, or his social philosophy grounded in the principle and ideal of equal opportunity. Few remarked upon the extent to which, during the campaign of 1932 and elsewhere, he battled against Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Few noticed that Hoover's books, American Individualism, published in 1922, and The Challenge to Liberty, published in 1934, articulated a vision of American exceptionalism and a critique of statism that conservatives might study with profit. Few noticed his manifold contributions to conservative causes during his ex-presidency. Above all, perhaps, his building of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, which he came to regard as his greatest benefaction to the American people. For present-minded activists of the 80s and 90s, Hoover's overall record of public service seemed less important than just two things: the alleged effects of his tax and tariff policies. Like the do-nothing Hoover of liberal caricature, the Hoover of supply-side economic orthodoxy became a cardboard figure, a rhetorical weapon to deploy against political foes. To Jack Kemp and other popularizers of the new doctrine, Hoover was synonymous with dour, fetishistic, old-fashioned, balance-the-budget conservatism, a shop-worn and defensive ideology which they hoped to expel from the Republican Party. Time and again, Kemp in particular contrasted what he called his optimistic brand of republicanism with what he derisively called Hooverism. Thus, even in what might be considered his natural constituency, Hoover became a political outcast whose name is rarely invoked except in criticism. Among libertarian thinkers today and those influenced by their scholarship, he tends to be perceived not as one of us, but as one of them. I would like to suggest to you that both of these stereotypes, the liberal one and the conservative one, are based in part upon mythology. The first myth, the liberal one, the one that most people in this audience probably grew up on, is that Hoover was a timid conservative who, as president, responded too little and too late to the challenge of the Great Depression. But Hoover, in the fall of 1929, was not an unalloyed conservative like his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge. He was an unabashed conservative activist for his time and a self-styled Republican of the progressive Republican brand who had supported Theodore Roosevelt for president in the Bull Moose campaign of 1912. Hoover's temperament and mindset were on full display that autumn. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, he did his best to mitigate its impact. As Hoover saw it, the recent long upward trend of fundamental progress, his words, had given rise to what he called over-optimism as to profits, followed by a wave of uncontrollable speculation in securities, a diversion of capital from business to the stock market, and the inevitable crash. Thanks, he said, to quick action by the Federal Reserve Board right after the crash, action to reduce interest rates and pump credit into the banking system, the volatility in the stock market had been completely isolated from the rest of the economy. For the first time in history, he asserted on November 5th, just a week or so after the crash, the crisis has been isolated to the stock market itself. Or had it? As the turmoil of late October gave way to the hangover of November, a new and more menacing reality intruded. The cataclysm had not been confined to Wall Street. The national psyche itself had suffered a terrific shock. In mid-November, Hoover informed the press that the collapse of the stock market had created an undue state of alarm in what he called the American mind. Hoover did not believe that this new mood was justified. But he could not ignore the fact that the debacle on Wall Street had created fear, uncertainty, and hesitation in business. Hesitation which, if unchecked, said Hoover, could plunge the economy into a depression. By mid-November, he was under growing pressure from his friends, his advisors, and the press to step forward as a national cheerleader and arrest the spreading miasma of fear. Hoover now took steps which changed the direction of American history. Instead of allowing the business downturn to run its course, as Andrew Mellon recommended, he intervened in the emergency on a scale unmatched by any previous president. Convinced that the nation's difficulties were, in his words, psychological rather than logical, he launched a national campaign to alter not the economy itself, but false perceptions of it. In November and December 1929, Hoover dominated the national stage with his unprecedented activism. He convened conferences at the White House of business leaders who enthusiastically pledged, in defiance of classical economic theory, to maintain current wage scales and carry on business as usual. He conferred with national labor leaders who promised not to seek destabilizing wage increases during the crisis. To counter an expected rise in unemployment, He persuaded prominent employers to expand construction projects in every prudent direction. An increase in construction and maintenance work, he asserted, would be a great balance wheel of stability. He pledged that the federal government would do its utmost to increase its own public works expenditures. He asked the nation's governors to do the same. To Hoover, these measures were not eccentric nostrums. Indeed, they reflected the teachings of the so-called new economics that he and many others had been touting during the 1920s. Wise or foolish, his policies had substantial support among economists and opinion leaders throughout the nation. In effect, Hoover was practicing psychiatric therapy, designed to restore his patients' badly needed confidence. The purpose of his plan, he told a group of reporters, was to disabuse the public mind of the notion that there has been any serious or vital interruption in our economic system. Everything, he said reassuringly, was going to proceed in the ordinary, normal manner. By sustaining wage rates, by avoiding labor unrest, and by fostering employment through enhanced construction spending, he would soothe the nation's badly rattled nerves. By stabilizing the economy, he would defeat the fear of unemployment and the emotions that threatened an economic breakdown. By early December, barely 3 weeks after he started, the presidential psychologist was convinced that he had succeeded. Confidence has been reestablished, he told Congress in his State of the Union message on December 3rd. A very large degree of industrial unemployment and suffering which would otherwise have occurred has been prevented. Wages, and therefore consuming power, should remain stable, he reported. And capital, which had previously been absorbed in stock market loans for speculative purposes, as he described them, capital was now returning to the normal channels of business. Hoover was proud of the extraordinary agreements that he had forged with industrial leaders. This is a far cry, he told them, from the arbitrary and dog-eat-dog attitude of the business world of some 30 or 40 years ago. It was a far cry, too, from the traditional governmental policy of laissez-faire, a doctrine he had previously and publicly condemned as archaic and unscientific. Confidently, deliberately, and self-consciously, he had abandoned the principle of political non-interference with the economy. As never before, the President of the United States had placed one man, himself, in charge of guiding it back to prosperity. And having done so, Hoover was eager to proclaim early success. At a press conference on March 7, 1930, he stated that all the evidences indicate that the worst effects of the crash upon employment will have passed during the next 60 days. Almost 60 days later, the cheerleader turned prophet was nearly ready to proclaim victory. In an address on May 1, 1930, to the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, he declared that his great economic experiment, and he used that word to describe what he was doing, of cooperation between government and the entire community had succeeded to a remarkable degree. He said, "While the crash only took place 6 months ago, I am convinced that we have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, we shall rapidly recover." 1 month later, on June 4th, he went all the way. To a delegation of citizens demanding a gigantic increase of federal public works expenditures to relieve unemployment, he replied that the economic tide had already turned. "Gentlemen," he told them, "you have come 6 weeks too late." Hoover's sanguine prophecies of early 1930 eventually cost him dearly in public disillusionment. But at the time, they did not seem so outlandish. Many other prestigious and seasoned observers, if you'll go back and look at the evidence, such as the National Business Survey Conference, also believed that the worst was or very soon would be over. Business was returning to normal. Business leaders repeatedly assured Hoover no further emergency stimulus package was needed. In the winter and early spring of 1930, in fact, the stock market itself gradually rebounded. And I just might add parenthetically that during that first year or so, people did not think that this was the catastrophe that we now know it became. They thought of it as a sharp, but in a sense, traditional kind of downturn. So Hoover was not alone in feeling optimistic, but of course those words came back to haunt him. To Hoover, these growing signs of recovery during the winter and early spring of 1930 vindicated his interventionist leadership. At the Gridiron Club's annual dinner in April 1930, he asserted triumphantly that the miseries of unemployment from speculative crashes were being cured before our eyes. It was being accomplished, he said, not by government doles or unemployment insurance, as some were now demanding, but, in his words again, by voluntary cooperation of industry with the government in maintaining wages against reduction and the intensification of construction work. A few nights later, speaking before the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he again touted his experiment in confidence building as a remarkable success. Once again forsaking the traditional path of laissez-faire, Hoover denied that the business cycle was a disease which must run its course without intervention. I do not accept the fatalistic view, he declared, that the discovery of the means to restrain destructive speculation is beyond the genius of the American people. On the contrary, the progressive Republican engineer seemed convinced that he had found the antidote in voluntary cooperative action outside government, action that he as president had instigated and promoted. By late spring, increasing numbers of Americans were not so sure. Across the country, unemployment seemed to be rising. The day after Hoover told the Chamber of Commerce that the worst was over, the stock market plunged in the heaviest trading of the year. Meanwhile, in mid-June, after months of heated haggling and recrimination, Congress enacted, and Hoover reluctantly approved, the protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff. The law raised the nation's tariff schedules to what critics cried were the highest levels in American history. Low-tariff Democrats accused Hoover of cowardice and howled that the tariff wall would throttle foreign trade and devastate the American economy. Hoover took solace from the law's flexible rate provision, which permitted him, upon recommendation by the Tariff Commission, to actually raise or lower rates by 50%. In this way, he reasoned, he could take the messy tariff issue out of politics and adjust rates on a scientific basis. By wise administration, then, he hoped that he could mitigate the tariff's ill effects. This leads me to a second myth about Hoover's handling of the Great Depression. Most of you are no doubt familiar with the storyline. The highly protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff is said to have been an infamous act of legislative folly, which raised American tariffs so high on imports that it ruined international trade and turned the slump of 1929 into the Great Depression. Lately, I have been investigating this storyline, and I must tell you that much of the scholarly literature on this subject does not sustain this interpretation. It seems that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was not the highest tariff in American history. Its overall rates were not much higher than those already in place under the existing Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922, a highly protectionist piece of legislation that did not seem to interfere with the prosperity of the 1920s. Even after the Smoot-Hawley tariff was enacted, nearly 2/3 of America's imports were subject to no import duties at all. Moreover, according to some academic specialists, there is little evidence that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had a major negative impact on the course of the Depression. One distinguished economic historian, Barry Eichengreen, has even found evidence that the tariff initially gave a boost to the domestic U.S. economy. Nor is there compelling evidence, it appears, that the tariff triggered massive retaliation by foreign countries, as is often claimed, leading then to an international trade war. With the possible exception of Canada, foreign retaliation in the form of higher tariffs on our exports appears not to have been as severe as once thought. In fact, much more modest than once thought. Now, to be sure, as the Depression deepened, American exports shrank dramatically. But according to some studies, the decline did not correlate with the new tariff rates. Other factors, such as Great Britain's abandonment of the gold standard in 1931, seem to have been more consequential. We must also remember that during Hoover's presidency, U.S. foreign trade constituted a very small fraction of our economy, accounting for perhaps 4 to 5% of the gross national product. In short, a number of historians and economists have concluded that there was little relationship between the much vilified Smoot-Hawley tariff and the actual course of the Great Depression. In the words of one of these scholars, Alfred Eckes, Smoot-Hawley is a molehill, not a mountain. Now, I am not inferring from this that the tariff legislation of 1930 was a good thing. My own research leads me to suspect otherwise. But after delving into the scholarly literature on this subject, I am not persuaded that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had anything like the vast explanatory significance that is so routinely attributed to it by some on the left and the right. Well then, if the Smoot-Hawley tariff did not necessarily make the Great Depression great, what about Hoover's huge tax increase of 1932? As I mentioned earlier, in mid-1932, near the nadir of the Depression, the Congress of the United States, under Hoover's prodding, enacted a massive increase in taxes. Before we recoil in horror at this deviation from our current orthodoxies, let us look at the record more closely. In fiscal year 1932, as the Depression intensified, the United States government incurred its largest peacetime deficit to date in American history. The shortfall approached a staggering 60% of all federal expenditures. Faced with a peacetime fiscal drain of unprecedented proportions, what was President Hoover to do? He could try, at least in theory, to make up the deficit by borrowing and thus increase the federal debt. But that, he believed, and he was not alone in so thinking, would simply overwhelm the private money markets and soak up precious capital badly needed for private investment and recovery. Nor could Hoover simply sit back and do nothing. For 150 years, the federal government had always attempted, except in wartime, to balance its budget. This was the regnant orthodoxy of 1932. An orthodoxy so powerful that Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats denounced Hoover in the election campaign for extravagant, unsound, radical economics and pledged the Democrats to institute both a balanced federal budget and a 25% reduction in federal expenditure if Roosevelt were elected. While Hoover himself had not in the past been an inflexible adherent of a balanced budget, he too, in early 1932, publicly declared that a balanced budget was now, under the circumstances, an absolute necessity. Why? In part because Hoover and most political and economic and business leaders believed exactly what he argued, that a balanced budget was the very keystone of real recovery, the bedrock of restored public confidence. Confidence, with the consequent flow of credit to business, was, in Hoover's judgment, the key. If the U.S. government could not control its own finances, how could economic recovery begin? But there was a second and probably more compelling reason for Hoover's tax decision. On September 21st, 1931, Great Britain rocked the world by abandoning the gold standard.